I recently made a video where I exposed a view that many should have in regards to this world. It was a difficult subject for many to deal with because it exposed some things that many people aren't quite ready to deal with yet. And being that that was the case, it was understandable and anticipated that there will be many that disagreed or had opposition to what was being communicated. I mean, I get it. It's not easy waking up to the world we're truly living in, and it's easier to reject the messenger than understanding the message. I get it. But with all that said, it still does not change the message and the truth of it all. We are at a moment in time where we have no choice but to wake up and come out from the strong delusion. We must love Yah and his truths more than we love this world and their mindsets and their ways. For many of us, we have been fortunate enough to have our eyes opened, but we still have family and friends that we desire to wake up and come out of the strong delusion. For me personally, I have a cousin who is more like a brother to me, and I've been trying to get him to understand the real world that he is in. He is waking up, just unfortunately not at the speed and level that is required of him based on the times that we're in. These times are deep. One thing I have tried to show him is how mind-controlled he has been. Because for me personally, when I started to wake up, this understanding of the mind control meant a great deal for me. Growing up, I never liked people trying to play games with me or taking advantage of me. Basically, I never wanted to be hustled, and if I ever got hustled, I always tried to learn and peep the game so it never happened twice. So for me, when I was awakened to the world that we live in, and I saw how strongly we just grew up in lies, it was important for me to peep the game and not allow myself to be hustled anymore. So this is exactly what I went back to understand. I went back to much of the programming that I was under, and I was able to see where certain thoughts and behaviors they came from. I had to do something that was very hard for me to do at that time, and that was humble myself and recognize that I was a follower and I was hustled and taken advantage of for a very long time. My mind was not my own. My thoughts were not my own. I was a victim to severe mind control. And it was only at that point, when I was honest with myself about the truth about me and my reality, that I was able to do something about it. So now, praise Yah, I am one that is helping free minds instead of being one that helps enforce control over them. This realization is important for anyone living in this modern world to deal with and to recognize. You see, though this realization was about me personally, I am not the only one that was under this. I was not the only one this mind control affected. It was literally everyone around me. Unless you grew up on a farm with no access to modern society, no public school system, no technology, no access to other people who had that access, you would have been affected. That's why it says Satan deceives the whole world. You, yes you, have been a victim to severe mind control. And let's be clear, the ones who doubt it or deny it, these are the ones who are under it the most. Now, this mind control has been waged against us from many different ways by many different methods. For instance, one major tool was the general education system we participated in. Whether public or private, it doesn't matter. The school system was created to develop a collective consciousness within a population and keep the general population thinking on one accord in regards to major topics. For instance, the shape of this earth and the power of your vote in a democratic world. Just to give examples, what the majority think about this are based off of indoctrination. Another example is the Christian church. The Christian church is a major example of a tool used for mind control and indoctrination on the population. How many people celebrate the Messiah's birthday on December 25th, even though there's not one scripture that tells us this date or even to celebrate his birthday? How many people say happy birthday, Jesus, when there's no record of this? This thought is obviously a thought learned through mind control, because it's definitely not based on fact or historic information. The point that I'm making is that we do things because we have been trained and conditioned to do so, without us ever being the wiser. There have been many different tools used against us, but the one tool that we need to look at is the biggest weapon ever to be used against humanity. That is this device, the television. The television is the biggest weapon ever to be used against humanity. And this major tool or medium has been used against the masses to control their minds and influence them to be exactly who the masses as a whole are today. The rise of the influence of this weapon is not widely spoken of unless it is spoken of in nice nostalgic ways, making us look back at our old programming and then miss it. CNN has done many specials over time that has shown the history of the coming of the age of television and the decades. And if you ever watch those with discerning eyes and not just trying to see history or be entertained, you can clearly see how very purposely and incrementally we have been mind controlled and conditioned to be exactly who we are today. But the thing about it is that when you're watching it, their side is very much one-sided. So if you're not one that really understands the real world that you're in, what they're actually saying could actually miss you. But with all that information that they gave, when used with discerning eyes, it can be very revealing to how manipulative the past century has been. So in order to help wake up minds, I think it's important to try to go back in the past and identify points where mind control started to take hold. And with this awakening, people can better come to terms with what has come against them. The television set, regardless of the size of it and where it is, because many of us are holding one right in our hands right now, it is one of the biggest weapons to ever be used against humanity. It is a major tool used to bring people into the strong delusion, aka the Matrix. And it needs to be examined and understood, because if you say you're not a victim of mind control, you are lying to yourself and you are deceived. If you no longer want to live in deception, it's time to deal with the truth and let it set you free. We're going to discuss the history of our mind control. Let's begin. Okay, so as you can imagine, this topic is pretty deep. In order to deal with this, we're going to have to set the stage for everything in order for things to be properly understood and put into full perspective. Let's deal with the influence of the television first. If we go back in time, according to Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, in the year 1948, 1% of U.S. households owned at least one television. This is obviously a very small percentage. So moving on in time, according to an article found on the Library of Congress site, only 9% of American households had a television set. But by 1960, the figure had reached 90%. So in just a decade, this piece of technology was in 90% of the homes in America, at least one television set. And that number was steady throughout history, never seeing peak drops. The peak ownership percentage of households with at least one television set occurred during 1996-1997 season, with 98.4% ownership. So in the mid to late 90s, almost 100% of households in America had at least one television set in their homes. But as you probably know, a majority of households had more than one set. I know my family did. So let's understand the big picture here and what this actually meant. As for the mainstream in our usage, the television is a one-way communication device. So by the 1960s, whoever had access to this device and technology now had the ability to communicate messages one way to 90% of the United States population. And that's what gave the television its power, the large reach it had over the population. It's like putting those billboards that you would see on the side of the road on the highways, putting it into your home so you can see it every day. And the power of that was enormous. Like if someone had a message that had said that the sky is green, and they said it every day on this device, 90% of the population would see this message as long as they tuned in. But a message that just said the sky was green would not keep the audience viewing. So if this is what I wanted my audience to believe, I might tell a funny story or create a storyline that had nothing to do with the subject of the sky being green. But I would always show the sky as being green. And maybe sometimes let actors talk about it in a scripted, controlled way. Now, in our reality, regardless of what is shown, it doesn't change the truth that the sky is blue. But it does suggest something that the audience may not have agreed with prior, and now they're hearing it. Does that make sense? Let me talk some more about it. Let's speak about those with influence. Those with influence and that had desires to steer the world now had access to 90% of the United States population. Now listen, I haven't dug deeper into the rest of the world because it honestly doesn't matter. This nation was a cultural leader of the world, so as they were influenced, they brought that influence everywhere else in the world. But I do not doubt that the statistics and the way that they work are very much similar. Just putting it all in perspective. Let's keep going. So by the 1960s, there was a product that people could communicate with the rest of the population through, and all they needed to do was get themselves on the sending side of this device, and they would have access to a whole population. So let's be clear about who had the first access. This one-way communication did not start by television first. It started decades before through the radio. People had begun to become accustomed to hearing what was happening all over the world through the radio in their homes or at their businesses. Control over the radio in the United States was first under control by the United States Navy. The radio was first used wartime for coordination and intelligence, and eventually for propaganda. As World War I approached its climax, most parts of the world heard President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points broadcast again and again over the radio. Now, I cannot find the audio of this, but this is the transcript. What he said was besides the point, though. President Wilson proposed a 14-point program for world peace, and then these points were later taken as the basis for peace negotiations at the end of World War I. And this was what the world was hearing in their homes. You can imagine how much trust was being developed. The United States was gaining in influence at that time, and then the president's message of peace was being broadcasted all over the world. But okay, the Navy initially controlled the radio until it decided that it would be better suited to be in control of a private company, the radio I'm talking about. Now let me properly set the scene here. We are almost at the end of the year 1919. World War I was declared an end on November 11th, 1918. At this time, the world was well under control by a few. The robber barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgans, they very easily yielded power over the country as captains of many industries. Rockefeller, the first billionaire of the United States, his estimated wealth in 1913 was estimated at $900 million, which is said to represent 3% of the United States GDP for that year. This was after the Supreme Court ruling in 1911 that made him even richer, forcing him to split up his company Standard Oil and break it up into 34 separate entities, which included companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, just to name a few. The year 1919 was also after J.P. Morgan started General Electric and controlled United States banking. And this was also after these men created the Federal Reserve. Now, if this information is lost on you, I do speak about all this in my Matrix series. I will not go into great depths here. I bring all this up to say that if you look at any of this and ignore the power and control that these men had, then you will be missing a great deal that answers a general question of, but why? It's too much to explain in this video, but the point you should hold is that the world was already snatched away in control. These powerful families, along with others, were the ones who steered the world in the direction that they wanted it to go. And please know and believe that during this period in time, the general public was well aware of these men and the power and control that they had. The general public knew of these men. The people worked at their companies. They were the major employers. They were not hidden in mystery as they are right now. But okay, with all that said, let's keep going with the history. On October 17, 1919, a new corporation was formed, the Radio Corporation of America. In Ron Chernow's book, House of Morgan, on page 308, he explains this. After the war, the United States feared the British monopoly of undersea cable communications, which had yielded invaluable wartime intelligence. The United States Navy favored the use of a new private corporation supported by Washington to battle Britain in the emerging field of radio technology. Privately, President Wilson notified General Electric that he wanted to counter Britain's cable monopoly with an American radio monopoly. Morgan money helped GE to buy out British interest in American Marconi. This was the name of the radio company owned by the Navy, which became the Radio Corporation of America. Washington stayed on RCA's board as a non-voting member. By 1921, 3 other American corporations partnered with GE in the RCA venture: AT&T, United Fruit, and Westinghouse. According to the book Tube of Plenty, The Evolution of American Television by Eric Barnell, this was the stock ownership percentage of RCA. General Electric, 30.1%. Westinghouse, 20.6%. AT&T, 10.3%. United Fruit, 4.1%. These were the companies that were now in control of the radio. Now let me help with a little context here. Let me show you how I look at all this when I hear about all these companies. When you dig deep into American business, it's easy to find the power and control. You just have to follow the money. You see, today, we're trained to look at all this by understanding it by corporations, which in turn takes the personal side out of your understanding. But when you know the history, things become much clearer because General Electric, Westinghouse, and AT&T were in primary control by JP Morgan. He was in control of these companies. So though there were different corporations in the mix, power was still in the hands of one. So when they say the ownership percentage of each corporation, all I say is JP Morgan 30%, JP Morgan 20%, JP Morgan 10%. The power and control is easier to understand when you understand these dynamics and understand American business. So be clear, JP Morgan was in control of the radio. That's what you need to understand. He was in control from its inception. And being that by this time, the robber barons all began to work together to have full control over this country through being the main lenders to the United States government, we know the Rockefellers and the other major families were also connected in this decision making. And so, it was important that I started here so that anyone that wants to understand the beginnings of this industry can understand this unequivocally without confusion. The radio broadcast communication in the United States that began in the United States was owned and controlled by JP Morgan and the other robber barons given control of the world in order to lead us to the world order that they were told to create. That should now be clear. Okay, so after the radio industry was created, the future of it was seen as central broadcasting. Now, I don't want to get too deep with this, but what do witches do? They cast spells. They're doing a broadcast. They know what they're doing. I'm just trying to expose the evil and the wickedness of this whole thing. That might be going too deep for you at this moment. Let's just keep going. In January 1926, the RCA Board of Directors approved the idea of a new company. It would be owned 50% by RCA, GE 30%, and Westinghouse 20%. GE and Westinghouse, along with AT&T, already had indirect ownership through RCA ownership, and this new company would lease under long-term contracts the AT&T web of wires. So all these companies were in cahoots with each other, but like I said, this is all JP Morgan working with himself. In September 1926, RCA announced the formation of the new company called the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC. Through NBC, events of national importance will be broadcast throughout the United States. The public will be assured of the best programming. And this is very similar to the Standard Oil promise, which is what got Standard Oil to be the largest. He became the standard of oil. But anyways, at this time, it was estimated that 5 million homes in the United States already had radios. 21 million homes remained to be supplied, so there was a big market. By assuring the highest quality programming, the belief was that all would buy one. This is how it worked out. RCA was the world's largest distributor of radios, handling all the radios made by General Electric and Westinghouse. And so this business partnership developed quality in the market and gained new customers and loyalty all around the United States. Yeah, GE and Westinghouse made the radio, while they also owned a percentage of RCA, the company who distributed them, while they all owned NBC. The manufacturer, distributor, and now broadcaster were all controlled by 3 companies, while these companies were controlled by one man, JP Morgan. Okay, so in 1933, NBC moved to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and they called it Radio City. This was a big deal. The phenomenon of broadcasting, holding millions spellbound, was being compared to theater, film, and other types of entertainment. But the difference was it was happening in people's homes. People sat in places and listened to what people said. They were so mesmerized by the fact that this was possible, immediate trust was built. And just so there's even more context, in 1928, Amos and Andy was one of NBC's top series over the radio. This was Amos and Andy. Yeah. In 1929, Columbia Phonograph Broadcast System, later called CBS, was created under the control of the Rockefeller family. When you go through the history and they give you these names of people that they say found these companies, you have to look back in their history and see who they were affiliated with. It's not hard to find these people after you just do a little bit of digging. But anyways, a new broadcast company, CBS, was formed. And then in 1943, a United States Supreme Court decision required NBC to sell one of its networks, Blue Network. It was later renamed American Broadcasting Company, ABC. These companies were forming amongst themselves, and though it might look like there was competition because there were different companies in the mix, the leadership of all of this was in the hands of a very small but powerful few. So by this time in 1943, there were 3 radio broadcast companies. Now, why does this matter in regards to the television? Where am I going with all this? It matters because of what happens next. Who made the TV? It doesn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things. What matters next is when it comes to the market. But I went into all that history to explain the foundation of control first. I believe firmly in foundation, and I've tried to be thorough so there is no confusion. I mean, I could have easily jumped to this point that we're about to get to, but if you don't understand that this industry was in the chokehold from when it first started, then the full dots of control might not fully connect, and I want them to. In the summer of 1946, RCA got its black and white television sets on the market. In 1947, the opening of Congress was televised for the first time. The television was adopted more quickly into urban American homes than any previous new communication technology before it. In 1946, movies and radios were the main way of entertainment for audiences. But over time, the television was adopted in the lives of Americans. Here's the numbers. In 1946, there are 20,000 TVs in the US, which represented 0.02% of the US households with televisions. In 1947, there were 44,000 televisions in the United States, which represented 0.04% of US households with televisions. In 1948, there were 350,000 TVs in the US, which represented 0.66% of the US households with televisions. Okay, here we go. In 1949, there were 1 million TVs, which represented 2% of US households with TVs. 1950, 3.9 million TVs, which represented 8.1%. 1951, 10.3 million, which represented 21.5%. 1952, 15.3 million, 32% US households with a television. 1953, 20.4 million, 42.5%. In 1954, 28.5 million, which represented 59.4% US households with televisions. And then in 1955, it's 64%. Until we get to the 1960s, with 90% of the United States households with at least one television set. All this within a decade. And let's also be clear that during this time, there were only 3 broadcasting networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and these were all controlled by the 1% of the 1% who controlled this world. They now had access to communicate whatever they wanted to say and promote through their new device. And if you don't think that was possible, then you don't understand the business of television. I mean, the main business is selling advertisement space within the programs because the television exposure was highly lucrative for businesses. They are called programs for a reason, but I don't want to jump ahead here. This new device changed the American family. What was said was just bringing a TV set into the house brought the need to rearrange the living room furniture away from the previous traditional focal point, such as pianos or fireplaces, large radios, and phonographs. Many families ditched the pianos for the televisions. The living room turned from being a more formal room into a more informal den or now living room, all because of the television. We have family rooms because of televisions. The television began to take over the way of living for the family, and it changed the habits of the children. Media historian Lynn Spiegel had said, "It was said that it was marketed by broadcasters, station owners, and the manufacturers of the television sets that it was hoped that the television would help cement together members of the new post-war, suburban, middle-class, nuclear family with a sense of renewed domestic values." Members of this new ideal family would stay at home together during their leisure time rather than run their separate ways all over town. Stronger bonds of affection and shared interests would form while everyone gathered around the living room's new electronic heart. Spiegel said, not only was it shown to restore faith and family togetherness, but the TV did it in the splendors of consumer capitalism. That's how the television was marketed to the masses, that it was something for the family. So with the programming, the television was now teaching the American population what it meant to be an American. And they were now being fed with the mindsets and influences that those who controlled this technology desired for them. It was first marketed as a device to bring the family together. And that wasn't false advertisement. It did. Families would watch their programs all together in the family room. But it did not take long for that to change once they started adding new programs to target different markets. And understand, the biggest effect came to the target market that this technology was designed for. It is said that the children were mesmerized by such early attractions such as Howdy Doody, and it would turn the children from being active doers to passive viewers, from irresistible forces to immovable objects. Their vision and physical development would suffer. They would ignore their schoolwork, give up their hobbies, and let innate creativity lie dormant. They would forget how to read and quite likely never learn how to converse and have conversation. They would be stunned physically, mentally, and emotionally. It was a sad prospect, it said. This was from Dorothy Barclay, a New York Times reporter reflecting on the late 1940s. Concerned educators were concerned that children were watching as many as 30 hours of TV a week, more than 3 hours on school nights. The television affected family dynamics and traditional parental authority. The concern was that youngsters, they could listen to radio programs while doing other things, but that the TV demanded a child's full attention, and it was more difficult to pry them away from the set after a show was over. And if we look at where we are today, 70 years later, we can see that these concerns were justified, but it's too late. All this change happened rapidly, and we really didn't even get into the mind control yet. What I first want you to get is that the target of the television was not the parents or the adults who were buying these television sets during the 40s and the 50s. It was actually for the new generation that was being born after the war. We know them as the baby boomers. This was the first generation to truly grow up in full mind control. They set the stage for the rest of us who were born to them. Now, they of course had no idea, and we cannot pass full blame onto them, but they were heavily mind controlled, and because of that, today, they are the hardest generation to speak to. Baby boomers have a higher level of education than any previous generation, with 88.8% having completed high school and 28.5% holding a bachelor's degree or higher. And they were the first generation to grow up seeing the television in their homes when they were a child. And the mind controlled started with them. And in order to understand this, we need to start talking about their generation. Because if you watch all of the events that happened in the 60s and the 70s with all the major change, it was for all of them. It wasn't the adults that were doing the sit-ins and the marches. It wasn't the adults protesting for feminism and all that other stuff. It was the youth, the baby boomer generation. And all that change didn't happen to them all because they were just rebels. It wasn't just independent thought, but it was because they were the first generation from young to be mind controlled and programmed. And so if anyone wants to come to me and say, well, hey, I'm not mind controlled, you really don't have a clue. Because the baby boomer generation was the first generation to be mind controlled, and this was 90% of them, because 90% of them had televisions in their home, and they were enrolled in the school system, which enforced many of the radical thoughts that they were hearing on television. This is too deep to discuss right now, so we're going to have to stop here and then revisit it. The stage had to be set and properly understood so you can understand where we're going in the next video. But listen, do not listen to people that says that they were never under mind control. I can show multiple points that those who desire to control you had access to your brain. It is not wise for you to be one that is so proud that you feel that you need to reject this truth. What is the reason for me even bringing this up? It goes back to the video before this. The strong delusion is real, and many denied how strong it was. So now, Yah willing, Those who are given the opportunity to hear and understand can now see some things that they might have missed and see some things they thought might have been a coincidence that really were not. Because this is not a game. You know, when people reject Yahusha, there's a major thought that most people say. They say Christianity is a tool of control. Well, yes, the way it has been taught in America, it definitely was. I mean, I don't even like the term Christianity, so I agree with you. Then there's people speaking against the Bible, saying the Bible is a tool of control. And yeah, the way it was used in the past, people definitely used it in this way. But they also did not allow people to read it for themselves. But there's no denying that it was used for control. But for people that still hold that view, please tell me why the same people that control the world now, why didn't those same people that are controlling us stop using the Bible for their control if they were already controlling us with the Bible? They could have if they wanted to, but they didn't. They created mindsets that were completely against the Bible, completely opposite. They didn't have Bible programs on the television where people were just hearing Bible verses all day. No, what they actually used as a tool of control, you now have it in your hand and you love it. While the one thing that can actually set you free, you have been programmed to believe that this is the control. And that's the problem. You need to get a hold of your thoughts and stop being controlled. I mean, if you're going to be taken down, at least let it be your own decision and not because you're controlled to think the way you do. The Bible has warned us against this trick. And if we actually read the Bible and did not speak against it, maybe this agenda wouldn't have been able to go so far. We are told, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of Elohim. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. How could you be taken advantage of if you actually believe that? We're told, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Elohim for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Messiah. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. If we were bringing our thoughts into obedience of Messiah, then these agendas would not be able to exist. And remember, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But Elohim is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. And so, if I were you, and maybe you felt a little overwhelmed by what was presented last week, feel blessed now that Yah loves you and is giving you a way of escape. These thoughts that we all have must be analyzed and reviewed. And the more you see other people's influence in your mind, the more I pray it gives you the strength to scrutinize all these thoughts and bring them into captivity to the obedience of Messiah. That's the only way the devil can allow you to break free, is if you come under the obedience of Messiah. You don't do it on your own. This right here is a big endeavor Yah has me on. I ask for your prayers over me and this ministry. We are in the last days, and if you're going to be ready for Yah's kingdom, you must not be in the strong delusion. As you wait between these videos, please make sure that you take the personal time to reintroduce yourself to Yahuwah through his word and cast down all strongholds in the name of Yahusha. I have a spiritual warfare prayer in the description box. I pray that helps you. It's time, though, to wake up and fight for your mind. These warnings will not be around forever. Please do this through the power of our Messiah and let his truth set you completely free. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please don't forget to like and share this video with others. Please send this video to anyone you know, particularly the baby boomers. It's time to get them in this conversation. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Don't forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. If for some reason you no longer see this channel on this platform, please look for my videos on my website, truthunedited.com. Thank you again for watching. Listen, I'm thankful for all of you. Thank you especially to those Elohim has placed it on your hearts to give, and you have done so. I thank you for your assistance with carrying out this ministry every week. I thank you for your blessings and your prayers and your support. They truly support this ministry. You have no idea. Thank you for your obedience to Yah's call on your heart. Okay, thanks again for watching, everyone. I love you all.